that everything that has been unearthed by scientists over the years, it gives us kind of a good foundation for research. It helps us to know, what those worlds were like back then, but it doesn't give us a full picture, not, anywhere near full picture. A lot of it is left up to speculation, but that speculation is actually what I enjoy so much about what I do. I like digesting the facts that were left behind in ruins, and also, of course, the writings from several ancient courses. But I also enjoy sort of imagining the world in which the people of antiquity existed. And that is actually what my works of fiction are based on, some history and some speculation. In researching my newest novel called The Oracle, which is set in Greece and deals with ancient Greek themes, I had the occasion to research a lot about that ancient civilization, and also have the benefit of being Greek myself. I actually was born and raised in Athens. I've done a lot of coursework in classical studies, and of course I was raised with the stories of the ancients, sort of from mythology to philosophy and everything else. So that's also sort of part of my DNA, if you will. And for my other novel that I brought up before, the historical, it's called The Judgment, and that one releases in October. That is set in ancient Israel and ancient Egypt, so I also delved a whole lot into those civilizations as well. And so I talked to a lot of historians and did a whole lot of reading, and in that process I sort of learned how the ancients lived their lives, from everything from what they wore to what they ate to how they did their hair, to how they worshipped, and just about every aspect of everyday life. And I thought it would be fun to bring some of that information together in a forum like this. So, of course, you might think, researching the ancient world and finding out all these little details about daily life, might even be good for a chuckle. I mean, one of the things I found out from reading Egyptian manuscripts about healing and medicine was that you heal a skin ulcer by mixing wasp's dung with the milk of a mother who has just had a son. And so you think, this is pretty esoteric information. And it's good stuff to know, who needs Lanacane, when it can be that simple. But really, all kidding aside, if you look at this information more closely, you will see that there's actually a lot of wisdom in it. And the people who lived in ancient times didn't have the benefit of a lot of technology or even scientific research. So they did something that we in the modern world often disregard. They sat in silence and looked within, and then they looked to nature. So, I mean, they certainly had more time for introspection and debate and the exchange of ideas. But that is actually how some of their most groundbreaking discoveries were made. And some of them are used to this day, and some have fallen by the wayside, but all of them are worth examining. Not because thousands of years ago societies were more complex than they are now, but because they weren't. Okay? Sometimes wisdom is found in simplicity, in breaking down concepts to their most elemental layers. We have a tendency in our world to overcomplicate things, but I find that the best understanding often comes from going back to basics. So that very concept is what I have based today's class on. I'll be covering a couple of different areas. First of all, I will talk about leadership, mostly in ancient Greece, but elsewhere as well, and the emergence of democracy and foreign policy. I'll be looking at ethics and how they shaped interpersonal and political relationships. I will discuss some lessons from ancient Egyptian medicine and how food and diet figured into health and healing. And finally, I will examine the contributions of the great philosophers from ancient Greece and Rome and how their wisdom rings true even to this day. So let's start by defining the ancient world for purposes of this lecture. Obviously, there were civilizations all over, advanced civilizations, I should say, all over the ancient world during those times. But for the sake of focusing our short time together, I will concentrate on the Mediterranean region. And that would be Greece, Rome, Anatolia and the Persian Empire, and Egypt. Because these are the societies that really shaped the foundation for Western civilization and all that we hold dear today. So one of those beloved Western concepts is democracy. Democracy was born in Greece, and specifically in Athens, in the 6th century BCE, the year 508 or thereabouts. The name comes from two Greek words, and that would be demos, which is the people, and kratos, which is the state. And basically it means that power is held by the people. And in Athens, it wasn't always that way. Actually, when the city-state formed back in the 7th century BCE, it was ruled by the aristocracy, and that was kind of the done thing back then. That was the accepted form of government, and it had been done that way in other city-states, and so, you know, why mess with a good thing, right? It worked fine. Not great, but fine. But the Athenians had a distinction. They were a very enlightened lot. They had, of course, organized themselves into this great new nation and city-state, by the way, being used interchangeably. But the Athenians weren't sheep to be herded. I mean, they actually were able to think for themselves, and they did think for themselves. And that set them apart from the rival city-states like Thebes or Sparta. So when things like enslavement of the poor by the rich or corruption among the ruling classes became evident, the people revolted. They turned to a man named Solon for reform. Okay, and Solon actually was he was the one who provided the foundation for the Athenian democracy by giving male citizens the right to vote, and also forming a parliament and giving some rights to the poor, not a lot, not to the extent that that some others did after him, but you know, he did all of this. That was actually the foundation for democracy, and it set the stage for his successor, Pericles, who was really one of antiquity's greatest leaders. And Pericles became known as Athens' first citizen because of the revolutionary programs he brought to the city. In the 5th century BCE, he almost single-handedly built Athens into a cultural and political powerhouse through his innovative policy. So here's a look at his leadership style that remains an example in the modern world. He made the fine arts a democratic endeavor. He firmly believed that everyone, regardless of socioeconomic status, should have access to the arts. He subsidized theater admission for the lower classes, just let them come to the theater for free. He used his own inherited fortune, you know, not to acquire more wealth for himself, but to sponsor artists. And he was actually the main funder, the producer, if you will, of one of the main plays of the day called the Perse, and it was by Aeschylus, who was, of course, one of the biggest playwrights that Greece has ever known. And he also believed that governance should lie with the people. Though there was a semblance of democracy when he came to power, he was the one who insisted on what's called radical democracy. It actually means different things, I think, today, but in Pericles' time, it was indeed a very radical concept. What this basically means is that citizens were paid by the state to serve in public affairs. So all of a sudden, you have people like the landless poor able to participate in their own government, a privilege that up to that point had been held for the aristocracy who served in office because of their birthright. Pericles' policy actually changed everything. So now every citizen, regardless of background, had a say in how his city was run, how funds were spent, and how laws were made and what laws were passed. There was equality for the first time in Athenian history. So it was, of course, a privilege to participate in state affairs, but beyond that, there was actually money in it. So for the first time, the poor felt powerful and independent, and that gave them pride in their city, it made them want to defend it, and it also made them work harder. So just as an aside here, the word idiot actually comes from the Greek. It comes from this time, from Pericles' time. It was actually a euphemism for someone who did not participate in politics. So in Greek, the word is idiotis, which means a private person. Okay, imagine that, right? A private person in ancient Greece. There was actually no tolerance for such a thing. I think there still isn't in Greece. There's no such thing as privacy. But Pericles famously said, "We do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business. We say that he has no business here at all." So it was, that you participate in politics or you're not really worthy of being a citizen. He made it easy. He gave everybody access. And so everyone, had the ability to do this. And so if they didn't have the desire, well, they were idiots. So Pericles was actually a friend of the people. Though Pericles was actually born into a noble family. Okay, he actually was born into the probably wealthiest and most influential Athenian family at the time. But he was careful never to reach for the silver spoon himself. In fact, he actually did just the opposite. He broke down the hedges and fences to his house so that those who could not afford it, who had a need, could actually come into his garden and partake of his fruit. He gave clothes to the elderly. He invited the poor to supper. And he paid people to serve on juries. Okay? And before long, he had the entire populace, not just the rich, who were, his people, but the entire populace behind him. And even in his private life, he was democratic. So according to Plutarch, who was, a great historian at the time, Pericles entered into quite a new course of life and management of his time. He was never seen to walk any street but that which led to the marketplace and to the council hall. And he avoided invitations of friends to supper and all friendly visiting. Even at a close friend's wedding, he went, but he only stayed until the feast was served, and then he excused himself from the table. So why did he do this? Well, it was twofold. In Plutarch's words, these friendly meetings are quick to defeat any superiority, and in intimate familiarity, an exterior of gravity is hard to maintain. So look at that. As early as 460 BCE, politicians were managing their image. The next time, I guess, you see a politician sort of kissing babies in any town in the USA, or giving a big tip to a worker at a sandwich shop, or not, you have Pericles to thank. We got that. So Pericles was actually a great orator and believed in the spoken word as a powerful means to an end. He had a natural gift, to be sure, but the lesson here is that he worked on his dexterity of tongue, as the ancients like to call it. It was not what he said, but how he said it. And there was this theatrical quality to his speech giving that held audiences rapt. Is that better? Can everybody see? And everybody can hear, right? If you can't, just raise your hand and I'll see what I can do. So he was a great orator, and in the words of Thucydides, who was a general and historian as well, and then Thucydides was asked whether he or Pericles was better at wrestling, and he said, "When I have thrown him off and given him a fair fall, by persisting that he had no fall, he gets the better of me and makes the bystanders, in spite of their own eyes, believe him." So there you have it, the power of speech. That was Pericles. And Pericles also believed in ornamenting a city so that it's more imposing in the eyes of the people, and therefore fills them with great pride and makes them want to protect it. He famously undertook the greatest building program in the history of Greece, and actually probably in the history of the ancient world. He commissioned the rebuilding of the Acropolis and the building of the Parthenon, which 2,500 years later still stands as at the top of that same hill, reminding every Athenian citizen of the greatness of their city. Now, Pericles emptied the coffers of the Delian treasury in order to do this. He spent a lot of money. This was a super expensive project. And some might say that this was foolish, but you know, there was a method to his madness, which I'm going to go over in a second. And also, I don't think you can convince a single Athenian to this day that that was money poorly spent, at least not this Athenian. But Pericles wasn't just buying eternal glory. He actually had something else in mind. The state funds he took to fund the project did not just go into marble and gold for the temples. He created jobs for the people who were desperately in need of money. And he summoned all arts and trades for this grand building project of his. So he gave everybody an opportunity. So any trade that could possibly have been practiced in ancient Athens, you know, there was an opportunity for it. This thing was of a massive scale. So whether you were an artist or a sculptor or an architect or just a guy who, you know, could hammer nails, you had a job here. So his strategy was to have everyone, and not just the military classes, but everyone partake in his share of the public money. But he wasn't going to give it out, okay? That is very important to note. He made them work for it. And what work? They weren't just schlepping stones and collecting a paycheck. They were building a monument that would be admired by generations, thousands of years later, a fearsome tribute to their great city. I'd like to show a short film that actually it's a portion of a longer film, but this short segment I think is really good for illuminating the building of the Parthenon and what a monumental project that was.
Construction plan. At its center would be a new Parthenon, a temple to Athena, and it would be one of the most astonishing buildings of the ancient world.
This new construction program was of unprecedented magnitude and expense. The Parthenon in particular was extraordinarily expensive. It was filled with all sorts of architectural refinements.
Pericles planned to spend over 5,000 talents in the first year alone. A total budget of more than $1 billion in today's terms. This project would require 20,000 tons of marble. The Athenian quarries at Mount Pentelicus, just outside the city, resounded as hundreds of workmen traced out and carved great blocks of marble from the mountain. This temple would be decorated like none before. Sculptors and craftsmen were gathered from all over the Greek world. With them stood Pericles, for he treated the building of the Parthenon as his own personal project.
He selected architects, he selected the men who designed the plans. Pericles was directly involved in the planning process.
Some protested that he was taking out the city like a prostitute. When the building was completed in only 15 years, his critics were silenced. and still is the most glorious symbol of Athens' empire. Here was the spiritual heart of the city, the mark of her wealth, power, and artistic genius.
When you first came through the door, you'd have been just stunned. You'd have been confronted immediately by an enormous 40-foot high statue of Athena in gold and ivory and studded with jewels. I think the impression of a statue of that size and with that kind of dressing must have been truly overwhelming.
Pericles had embellished his temple like no other. Though this astonishing statue has since been lost to history, other treasures from the Parthenon have survived for over 2,000 years. The most famous is the Parthenon frieze, a 500-foot-long stretch of carved marble which ran around the inner wall of the temple. The Parthenon frieze is only 2.5 inches thick at its maximum depth, and yet in this space the sculptors carved rank upon rank of crowded figures, a great procession of Athenians, glorious and elegant. Here Pericles offered his fellow citizens a vision of themselves and their democratic state at the height of their glory.
Democracy itself becomes heroized in that monument. It's a very democratic thing that wants to include all those citizens who participated in beating off the first great threat to democracy, which was from Persians. These are ideals to which you can aspire.
The monuments that Pericles built for his fellow Athenians still stand on the peak of the Acropolis. They remain the most striking legacy of classical Athens, an enduring testament to the achievements of the world's first democracy.
Okay. When we speak of leadership in ancient Greece, there was no one more charismatic or effective than Pericles. But also, no conversation about leadership is, and especially political leadership, is complete without discussing political philosophy and ethics. The Greeks may not have invented political philosophy, but they certainly perfected it from a technical standpoint. And the reason was, philosophy was a prized virtue in that ancient culture. And thinkers were not only free to pursue solutions and new wisdom, they were actually celebrated for it. Well, some were celebrated for it, others were executed for it, but let us not split hairs. The point is that there were many philosophers, and they contributed greatly to this way of thought. Now, the biggest presupposition in political philosophy was the concept of ethics. Who shaped our current view of ethics and its contribution to the political system were these three individuals: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Now, the apex of that triangle, Socrates, was the first to treat ethics as a distinct field of inquiry. He famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And what did he mean by that? Well, the short answer is that he was challenging the widely accepted virtues, the widely accepted norms. His contemporaries followed a way of life prescribed by their ancestors without ever questioning it. And according to Socrates, nothing was a given, even that the sky is blue. Okay? Everything required inquiry. Everything was put on the stand and asked to defend itself. So, and even when his own death knell sounded, while he was awaiting execution, he had the opportunity to escape, but didn't. Okay? Citing the laws of Athens and his own view that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. In the end, Socrates died by his own hand, right? He was given a cup of hemlock, which is a poison, and asked to drink it. And he took it, and he drank it, and subsequently died. So he died by his own hand, and he became this sort of universal symbol for political authority overpowering political philosophy. And that's an example that we have seen over and over, even in modern times. If you think about Tiananmen Square in China, or the imprisonment of a democratically elected leader in Burma, and on and on. Socrates actually never wrote anything down, but his student, Plato, did it for him. And Plato is known as one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. And he continued Socrates' work even after his death, but in a way that was less inflammatory to the state. The Republic of Plato, to this day, is probably the leading work on political philosophy. And in the Republic, Plato said basically that the moral psychology and political philosophy are one and the same. He likened the city to the soul. He said that the soul, just like the city, is divided into three parts. There is the rational part, or rational class, and that is what should rule. There's the spirited part, which corresponds to things like courage, for example, and that should support the rule of the rational part. And then there's the appetitive part, which would be, the passions, and that should exist, but it should agree to be governed. Okay? So the comparison between the soul and the city is actually very logical. So basically, the just and ethical person enjoys personal peace and harmony, which is advantageous no matter how he's treated by other men or by the gods. I mean, look at Socrates, right? I mean, he died peacefully even though he was persecuted. And correspondingly, the just society enjoys civic unity, which helps it avoid the supreme evil of civil war. Now, to expound upon that, Plato said that every soul has 4 virtues. They're called aretes in Greek. 4 virtues. One is wisdom, and that corresponds with the rational part of our being. Then there's courage, which is represented by the spirited part. And moderation, which is the spirited and the appetitive parts giving way to reason and letting reason rule. And then there's justice, which basically means all 3 of those parts of the soul doing their fair share and actually not one taking more than the other. So it's sort of a state of equilibrium, if you will. Okay? Now, the Republic is less political than philosophical. Plato actually wrote some political works as well. Some of his later works, including the Statement and the Laws, dealt more with politics proper. But what the Republic did was lay a foundation in ethics that he and Socrates believed was inseparable from politics. The Republic was actually a rumination on ethics, what it is, and why a person should possess it. And then came Aristotle, who was a student of Plato and later became a teacher himself, and most notably to Alexander the Great. Aristotle did his own exhaustive research on ethics and virtue. And actually to encapsulate Aristotle into a few minutes for the sake of this class is an injustice, because his school of thought is actually a unique study into itself. And if any of you are truly interested in Aristotle, write it down on the evaluations that you're going to fill out later, and maybe I'll come back and teach a class just about him, because like I say, he is sort of in a class by himself. And also what he taught is extremely complicated. But let me see if I can kind of break it down into a basic understanding of his ethical doctrine and some of the significant contributions he left behind, which we can regard today as lessons. First and foremost is Aristotle's search for the highest good. That in Greek is called eudaimonia. It's the highest happiness that humans are capable of. And this is distinguished from what is good. In other words, to be healthy, or to have friends, or to have wealth, or to experience joy. These are things that are good. But eudaimonia, the highest good, encompasses all of these things in balance. Okay? Now, according to Aristotle, the highest good is reached by virtue and excellence. And those things are not found in some contemplative state. They are found in doing. In other words, happiness does not come to us by chance. We must engage every day in the virtuous activity that will earn happiness. So happiness is an earned endeavor. Now, human beings, of course, differ from other animals in that they have a rational soul. That is, our ability to use reason. So Aristotle breaks down the concept of ethics into two parts. The part of the soul that can use reason, which would be the intellect or practical wisdom, and the part that is ingrained, but nonetheless able to follow reason, and that would be our personality or our character, maybe our inherited traits. So when both of these areas are developed during the course of life, starting with early childhood, by the way, the virtuous person will emerge. And he can be identified thus, according to Aristotle. He will not engage in something he considers shameful, and will forego a pleasure that is not deemed virtuous. Every time. Okay? It seems easy, right? I think we all do that to a large extent. But it isn't that easy, because human nature does not always allow for this. In fact, the mind needs to be trained very rigorously in order to arrive at that state. Now, Aristotle's theoretical end goal is very much a tempering of the human spirit, or of human nature rather. But it is also where its highest good can be found. I know that's complicated to encapsulate into a really short segment. But let me give an example that might help. So when faced with a certain situation that might be deemed difficult, people who have not fully exercised ethical virtue, according to Aristotle, face an internal counterpressure or longing for some pleasure or a need to express anger or outward emotion. Now, none of these things, he thought, are consistent with virtue in the way he saw it. So in such situations, the response of the non-virtuous or marginally virtuous would be one of these. First is continence, what we call in Greek enkratia. That's the ability of people to control their reaction to a degree. So maybe you don't burst out in anger, but you grit your teeth or whatever. That gritting of the teeth shows that a person has not fully embraced the ethical self. And these people are not altogether virtuous, but they generally try to do what a virtuous person does. The second response would be incontinence, which is what we call akratia. That's the inability to hold back. It's a full-on emotional outburst, okay? Bursting out in anger or what have you. And then there is vice, and that is, I think, the worst of the three, according to Aristotle. So for people who exhibit vice, ethical virtue just goes out the window, okay? They don't even subscribe necessarily to the idea that justice, courage, temperance, and the like are good. These people are driven by a desire for gluttony and self-service. So they have a greed, a need for more and more. And that Aristotle defines as evil and the ultimate path to unhappiness. Now, even though Aristotle's doctrine was based on emotional temperance, it didn't mean human beings had to train themselves to not experience emotion. Okay, that's impossible. I mean, we're human beings, and that's ingrained in our nature. So, but he just concerned himself with the response. Okay, so it's okay to have an emotion such as anger or fear, as long as it does not interfere with the rational process or does not cause you to lose control. And that is what he taught. And that he called the training of the passions. In other words, a virtuous human being must learn to master these emotions and experience them in the right way and at the right time. Okay? It's what we call emotional intelligence today, roughly, and we can thank Aristotle for it. So I could go on and on about ethics, but like I said, that's a class all on its own. But I want to move forward and discuss the contributions of the ancients in another arena, namely medicine. Now, it's impossible to talk about modern medicine without a tip of the hat to the Egyptians. The study of medicine and healing goes back to Egypt in the 30th century BCE. The ancient Egyptians knew how to set bones, how to heal disease by prescribing botanical remedies, and how to conduct surgery even. Okay? In fact, the earliest recorded surgery happened in Egypt around 2750 BCE, in the 28th century BCE. And that's remarkable when you consider that was almost 5,000 years ago. But actually, if you think about it, it actually makes sense. Since the Egyptians practiced mummification, they had at least some degree of knowledge of the human body. Mummification involved the removal of organs from the body through orifices, basically, for lack of a less descriptive term. So they knew what was where. They knew that the brain was here because they used to take a hook and insert it through the nose and crack open the skull and then pull out the brain that way. And they knew what the organs were in sort of the abdominal cavity, right? Because they would make a slit in the groin and remove everything that way. So they knew what was where and what it looked like, and they probably even knew what it did. And in addition to this, the Egyptians practiced surgery. Now, archaeology has yielded various types of surgical instruments, as you can see here. And that includes forceps, knives, hooks, saws, spoons, all of that. They presumably used incense. I believe that's a holder there for some incense. They used incense to cauterize the instruments and thus disinfect them. And they used needles to stitch up openings after they were done. I think that's pretty cool that they figured that out way back then. So the Egyptians definitely have their bona fides when it comes to medicine. So it sort of stands to reason that whatever writings they left behind have some relevance. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the medical papyri. The Edwin Smith papyrus is the oldest known document dealing with surgery for conditions such as fractures, injuries, and even tumors. Okay, it indicates sutures for open wounds, splints for fractured bones, immobilization for spinal and head injuries, and other procedures we continue to use today. I want to share some of those case studies in the Edwin Smith papyrus because I think that they're very interesting. But first I need to give the caveat that none of this is for interpretation of medical conditions, and do not try this at home. And when you hear what I have to say, you'll really know that you don't want to try this at home. So the first is the observance of a gaping wound at the shoulder. And basically in the papyrus, it's said that when you examine a man having a gaping wound at his shoulder, where the flesh is laid back and the sides separated, and it's sort of like unrolled, like this is a roll of linen, is unrolled. I love these, similes, they're great. And if it's painful and he raises his arm and he exhibits pain, then draw it together and stitch the gash, okay? And then it goes on to say that the physician used to bind that wound with fresh meat on the first day. So, you just kind of take a steak put it on the shoulder, and then bind it together. And then on the second examination, a couple days later, if the stitching is loose and the wound is open, the physician should bind it together with 2 strips of linen and then treat it with grease, honey, and lint until it's healed. Like I said, with his Lanacane, right? So another interesting remedy from the Edwin Smith papyrus concerns an inflamed wound on the breast. That means that the wound is gaping and red and swollen and hot, and maybe the patient has fever. And the prescription for drawing out the inflammation involved the application of willow tree leaves and dung, okay? That sounds really sanitary. And then poultices of northern salt and ibex grease, and sycamore leaves, and something called garden tongue. I'm not really quite clear on what that is. So now the Edwin Smith papyrus actually deals mostly with actual medical practices, but there are other papyri that deal largely with incantations and magic spells meant to drive out the demons that are causing disease. Okay, so many times it was actually a combination of both. You would have the medical procedures and you would have the magic spell, and that was used to heal. And the interesting thing here is that yes, medicine was indeed practiced, actually on a pretty high level considering the time, but they did not discount faith. Okay, and so faith, in fact, expressed through these magic spells and whatnot, faith was an integral part of healing, and they saw that, way back then. So even though, it sounds strange that they would make an incantation, think of it as, maybe a prayer or, what have you, in the modern world. But that was definitely a part of it. Now, the Ebers papyrus dealt more with potions and magic spells, and some of what is in this papyrus is actually the longest one of a lot of them. Some of what is in here, I've read the whole thing. I can tell you it's contestable at best, but there are some remedies that are interesting. Some of them actually make sense. So I'll share a couple of those. So for the common cold, they took the milk of a mother that has recently given birth to a son, and then they chased it with an incantation, of course, but that was their remedy. For a headache, they smashed together flour, incense, wood of wa, which is a native tree to the Nile Valley, sycamore seeds, mint, horn of a stag. You can find that at CVS again. Seeds of zart, mason's plaster, and water. And then they made this paste and applied that to the head. Good as new. Open wounds were treated with honey, because honey is an antiseptic. I mean, that is a fact. Actually, honey has antiseptic properties, especially honey that has not been boiled. Okay? And aching legs were massaged with this mud that came from the Nile Valley. And my favorite one was for a constipated child. You would take a book. It says an old book, but obviously that was they referred to papyrus because at the time they didn't have an actual book. And so an old book is boiled in oil and then applied to the belly. Problem solved. In ancient Egypt, actually, there was a number of herbal remedies used, and they very much believed in food as medicine. Here are a couple of examples. And so the Egyptians actually consumed a whole lot of garlic, which was thought to offer endurance and strength, plus serve as a remedy for a number of ailments. Cloves of garlic were considered so miraculous that the Egyptians actually buried their dead with it. In fact, cloves of garlic were found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. I don't know if any of you remember ever reading that. But garlic, peeled, mashed, and steeped in vinegar and water, was taken internally to relieve toothache and sore throat. And it was also used as a gargle. Garlic mashed in olive oil was used to treat bronchial issues and chest colds and the like. Now, we're talking about raw garlic, right? I mean, it wasn't cooked garlic. Didn't actually do much for their social lives, but it probably helped in these ailments. But then onions were thought to be beneficial to the cardiovascular system and also kept digestive problems at bay. So the Egyptians consumed a lot of onions. It was actually a very staple part of their diet. And coriander was thought to have cooling, stimulant, and digestive properties. The seeds were used in cooking to temper intestinal gas, and they were made into a tea to benefit the urinary tract. It was actually thought to be to heal cystitis or bladder infections. Cumin was mixed with wheat flour and a little water and made into a poultice to apply to joints to relieve arthritis. Honey was a bit of a cure-all because of its antiseptic and antifungal properties, as we talked about earlier, and along with grease, which the grease actually was from animals for the most part. It's just animal fat from animals like a goose or an ibex. Those were the most popular types of grease. But then when you mixed honey with grease together, it was used extensively to treat open wounds and burns. And castor oil, along with figs, dates, and tamarind, was used as a laxative. No surprise there. I mean, I think we know that even to this day. But castor oil back then was actually one of those miracle potions. Okay, its root was cut into small pieces and added to water, and then placed on someone's head who was not feeling well, and it was supposed to just automatically make them feel better, almost upon application is what it said in the papyrus. And its fruit, castor fruit, I guess. It was cut up and then mixed with oil and applied to the head of a woman to stimulate hair growth. How about that? There are a couple of others that I didn't have here on the slide, but an infusion of pomegranate root in water was strained and drunk to relieve tapeworm. Okay? Apparently it paralyzed the worm's nervous system, so they just fell off. It's wild. And then leaves of willow, sycamore, and acacia were used widely in several poultices. And actually acacia was very much a remedy for eye diseases. And if you look at these papyri, you'll see that eye diseases were just some of the most common ailments in ancient Egypt. So there's a lot dealing with the eye, but acacia figures prominently in almost all of it. So, and then there was the matter of diet. Now, not just the Egyptians, but probably everyone in the ancient world had something to say about diet. So let's start with this entry from one of the other papyri called the Insinker papyrus. The life that controls excess is a life according to a wise man's heart. Vegetables and natron are the best foods that can be found. Illness befalls a man because the food harms him. He who eats too much bread will suffer illness. He who drinks too much wine lies down in a stupor. All kinds of ailments are in the limbs because of overeating. He who is moderate in his manner of life, his flesh is not disturbed. Illness does not burn him who is moderate in food. So this was something that one of the papyri actually states as kind of like a mantra. This is what they were following back then. Now, what this is trying to say actually is that food is integral to good health, and the misuse of it can actually bring about bad health. Now, the study of food has been around for thousands of years and has penetrated across cultures. And I wanted to share a few of the foods that we consider beneficial today that happen to have their origins in ancient times. Okay, the first of this is chia. These tiny little black seeds, I think a lot of us know them and love them today, but it's like they're sort of new to us. I mean, they've only been on the surface for the past few years or so, but these originate actually in Central and South America, and they were a primary source of nutrition for Aztec and Mayan warriors. In fact, they believed that a spoonful of these seeds would sustain them for an entire day. Okay? So actually, it's not that far from the truth when you consider what's in these. Chia has an incredible amount of nutrients, actually, including significant amounts of complete protein, dietary fiber, calcium, phosphorus, and omega-3. And it can also, very interestingly, retain water and prolong hydration and promote electrolyte balance, even during physical activity. So that's probably why the ancient warriors really favored these. I can see how that would be useful for a warrior. And then there's cinnamon. Now, cinnamon in ancient Rome was actually prized more than gold. It was believed to have curative properties for any number of diseases, including the flu, colds, inflammation, and even poisonous bites. So now today we know that cinnamon indeed has anti-inflammatory properties, and something the ancients maybe didn't know, it can control blood sugar. And barley. In ancient Rome, the soldiers actually ate a lot of barley, which is probably due to the grain's ability to fill them up and keep them feeling full. Now, sometimes they couldn't eat much because they were, on the run all the time, so they had to depend on something that was very nutrient dense and gave them maximum nutrition and evened out their blood sugar. And barley did that. So we actually know today that barley can also reduce cholesterol because it's high in beta-glucan, which binds with bad cholesterol and prevents it from being absorbed. And then there's olive oil, my favorite. In ancient Greece, olive oil was used for everything, from cooking to anointing kings. Okay? It was prized as a perfect elixir, like a gift from the gods. And Hippocrates, who was sort of the father of medicine, if you will, he called it the great therapeutic because he believed it relieved everything from arthritis to skin conditions. And history actually proves Hippocrates right. We have since learned that olive oil is beneficial for the cardiovascular system because it is a good fat and it's anti-inflammatory. These are just a few. There are others. In fact, many of the superfoods we recognize today have their origins in ancient times. Think about the Bible, for example. How many times have you seen references to pomegranate, walnuts, almonds, figs, dates, olives, lentils, beans, barley, spelt, honey, and let's not forget apples. So, when speaking of food in antiquity, I'd like to bring one of the Greek sages into the conversation. I speak of Pythagoras of Samos, who perhaps was the single most influential and mystical of the great teachers in the ancient world, at least in my opinion. Pythagoras lived in the 6th century BCE and contributed a lot in the areas of mathematics, astrophysics, music, and their relationship among God, man, and nature. But Pythagoras actually never wrote a thing, so we depend on the attributions of his contemporaries and successors to truly understand his doctrines. And he's another subject that is worthy of a class on his own. I'm going to come back to Pythagoras in the final section of the presentation, but for now, I want to just cover a little bit about Pythagoras' take on food, because it's actually kind of different from some of his contemporaries. Now, Pythagoras believed that meat actually clouded the faculties. So he believed that anytime a big decision was to be made, such as a jury deliberating on a ruling, meat should be avoided. But there was actually another reason, I think, that he and his adherents did not eat meat or even fish. And that was because they believed in something called metempsychosis, which is just the transmigration of souls. Okay, so according to his school of thought, a soul may come back in an animal form, but not necessarily a human one. So just as one would not eat human flesh, one was forbidden from eating animals. Now, Pythagoras' particular brand of vegetarianism also prohibited the ingestion of beans. The thinking there is that beans were hard to digest, and so they therefore inhibited the ability to reason and concentrate. But another thought that sounds a little bit more likely to me is that there was this ancient disease called favism that certain people were susceptible to, and they would actually die from. It was actually a deadly disease at the time. So I think that's probably why they prohibited the eating of beans, but it's anybody's guess. And then when Pythagoras went to pray or contemplate, he followed a very regimented diet. And Pythagoras was actually he believed very much in silence. and meditation. So he did this quite a lot. So food to him was very important to achieve the state of mind that he wanted to. So what he took as food was consisted of equal parts of poppy and sesame seeds, and the skin of the sea onion from which the juice had been thoroughly extracted, the flower of daffodil, the leaves of mallows, and a paste of barley and peas to which he added wild honey. And for a beverage, he actually took the seeds of cucumbers, some dried raisins, the flowers of coriander, the seeds of mallows and purslane, scraped cheese, meal, and cream mixed together with and sweetened with wild honey. Now, and he claimed that this was actually the diet of Hercules, while Hercules was wandering the Libyan desert. So who knows, maybe it was. So that's a little discourse on food and its impact on optimum health and clarity. So now let's turn to philosophy. We touched a little on this earlier when we spoke of political philosophy and ethics, and of the three main philosophers of ancient Greece, which were Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But the field of philosophy was actually much broader than that, not only in Greece, but also in the Roman Empire, as well as the Persian Empire and elsewhere. So today, since our time is limited, we're going to look at some wisdom left behind by some of the most famous philosophers, and maybe find a nugget or two within those that we can use in daily life. So since we were just talking about Pythagoras, I'd like to start there. Pythagoras was an ascetic and a sage and a mystic who came up with some incredible mathematical theories, including his most famous of all, the Pythagorean theorem, right? And also the symmetrical geometric solids, also a very sort of groundbreaking concept in mathematics. He was also known, though, for his symbolic aphorisms, that is, sayings with hidden meanings. So there were actually 39 of these that Pythagoras supposedly left behind, and they were written down by his students. But we don't have time to go through every single one of them, so I would like to maybe just share a few today. Number one, declining from the public ways, walk in unfrequented paths. And that is just thought to mean, very simply, that solitude is a virtue, and as is the choosing of your own path, rather than following. Assist a man in raising a burden, but not in laying it down. This means help those who are diligent, but shun those who are lazy or who avoid responsibility, because indolence, according to Pythagoras, was the greatest sin. The wind blowing, adore the sound. Pythagoras here reminds his disciples that God is heard in the voice of the elements, and that all things in nature manifest through harmony, rhythm, and order. Govern your tongue before all other things, following the gods. This means words can be misinterpreted and can hurt others. So when in doubt about what to say, don't say anything. Silence is golden, in other words. Receive not a swallow into your house. The swallow here stands for flighty persons, or maybe mindlessness, your own mindlessness. So neither one of these had a place in Pythagoras' sphere. A Pythagorean should always be mindful and aware, and should only surround himself with serious and rational thinkers. Offer not your right hand easily to anyone. This refers to wisdom and counsel, and that was, at the time considered the right hand. Okay, so the fact that these should be held close to the vest, unless another person proves worthy of them, was very central to Pythagorean doctrine. They were very, very secretive society, and there are Pythagoreans even today, and they continue to be secretive in the same way. It was better to be secretive, they thought, than advertise the doctrines of the way. I mean, those should be something that other people seek out, and something that is earned. When rising from the bedclothes, roll them together and obliterate the impression of the body. What would that mean, right? So Pythagoras actually directed his disciples, who had passed from ignorance into intelligence, to eliminate from their recollection all memory of their former spiritual darkness. For a wise man leaves no form behind him that can be misused by those who have not achieved enlightenment. And having departed from your house, turn not back, for the Furies will be your attendants. Now, once you become a seeker, you can never turn back to the ways of ignorance, and I think that's kind of obvious. Knowing a little about the mystery of divinity leads to more suffering than knowing nothing at all. So either you go all the way, or you don't even embark on the journey, is what he was trying to say. I'd like to also talk a little bit about the 7 sages of Greece and what is called the Commandments of the Seven, which is a compilation of their work that appeared on a stela at Delphi, which was an ancient sort of spiritual center and oracular center in ancient Greece. The 7 sages were Cleobulus, Bias, Pittacus, Solon, Thales, Epimenides, and Chiron. The stela itself has actually never been found, but what was found in Afghanistan, of all the places, was a stela erected by an